and welcome. Delighted to be here. This is going to prove to be, I hope, a very spirited discussion. We've got, you see we've divided the gender balance up nicely, 2 men, 2 women. We've got a nice mix in the audience too. But before we go any further, I'd just like to introduce this incredibly distinguished panel, and starting with Natalie over on the left, as well as being our hostess, which I'm sure a lot of you are well aware, and a custodian of this extraordinary house. She's a journalist, author. Her first history book, and I'm very jealous to have to admit this, having written quite a few before I got anywhere near to the Sunday Times bestseller list. It was a Sunday Times bestseller, The Mistresses of Clevedon, so very suitable, 3 centuries of scandal, power, and intrigue. And her follow-up, The Women of Rothschild, the untold story of the world's most famous dynasty, is published in a couple of weeks, but the good news is it's already available, and I think you've probably got a copy in front of you. Have you, Natalie? So, and just to remind everyone, this is a literary festival, and we are signing books, and by the time the event's finished, in case I don't remind you at the end, please come over to the bookshop where all 4 of us will be signing our various books, and in the case of 3 of us, that's quite a number of different books, actually. But moving on to Dan, next in line. He's a very familiar face to anyone who watches Channel 5 in particular, but history documentaries. He's a historian, broadcaster, journalist whose many best-selling books include The Plantagenets, The Hollow Crown, The Templars, Crusaders, and most recently, the book in front of him, wonderful history of the of the Middle Ages, Power and Thrones. Described, I think, in the Sunday Times as the finest history of the Middle Ages, and it doesn't get better than that, does it? Moving on to Hallie next to me, Hallie Rubenhold. She's a best-selling historian, broadcaster, and historical consultant for TV and film, as indeed all of us are, actually. But Hallie seems to have a number of projects on the go. Her books include Lady Worsley's Whim, The Harlot's Handbook, and most recently, and Tellingly, The 5, about the lives of the women murdered by Jack the Ripper. It won the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction, which is the prize for non-fiction in this country, and was named Hay Festival Book of the Year. And given the content of the conversation today, I should add, I think, that her focus on the victims of murder rather than on the perpetrator has been credited quite rightly with changing people's attitudes to real crime and the concentration on the killers rather than the victims. So, I mean, I think that's a pretty impressive thing to have done in her career, and she's really only halfway through it, I think it's fair to say, Hallie, isn't it? I'm not going to go on about myself, because that's not really the job of the chair. I'm Saul David. I'm a military historian and broadcaster. I've written many history books, and the most recent is SBS Silent Warriors, and that's available at the moment. So let's kick off with the discussion. Great Men, Forgotten Women. Well, we were all having a chat about this, and we could, of course, go down the traditional route of just saying, why on earth have women been so marginalised by history? As indeed they had been, probably not so much anymore. We're going to widen the discussion out a little bit further to really asking the question, what is history all about, actually? And it's not just about women, of course, who've been marginalised in the traditional male retelling of history. But I think we'll all start with some kind of general remarks on whether we believe this is true, great men, forgotten women. I think it's hard to disagree with it. But I just want to make a couple of comments about some of my books. I mean, I write military history, and you would have thought, well, of course, military history, generally speaking, apart from the odd martial female character, Elizabeth I, the Amazons, the Rani of Jhansi, who I wrote about in my book, The Indian Mutiny, my stories have really been about men fighting wars. But I think my best books actually have been about war more generally. So it's not just about the fighting, it's been about the impact on society. And I mentioned the Indian Mutiny book. One of the things that attracted me to writing the story of the Indian Mutiny, the Great Rebellion of 1857 in India, was the sense that it wasn't just a fight between soldiers. This was a whole society, that is British Indian society, caught up, and also the Indian civilians themselves. I mean, no one's ever done the correct figures on how many people died in that conflict, but it was at least 1 million, and it was possibly more. And the vast majority of those casualties would have been civilian casualties. So this is like a kind of Second World War horror show. Now, if you move on from that story, and I briefly mentioned the Rani of Jhansi, I mean, one of the great heroes in British Indian history, one of the four great heroes of the so-called War of Independence, which is how the Indian Mutiny is remembered today in India, is the Rani of Jhansi. You'll see statues to the Rani all over India. She certainly hasn't been forgotten by history. Now, move on to a more recent book of mine, Crucible of Hell, which is my last book. I did promise I wasn't going to talk about my books, didn't I? I have to apologize, but it's sort of relevant to the discussion. One of the things that, again, I found completely compelling about the information and the evidence in that book was the sense that this was an island in which the whole community was caught up in the fighting. So there were as many sources that dealt with the civilians on Okinawa, almost the final battle of the Second World War, as there were the soldiers, the Japanese and the American servicemen. And also, interestingly enough, I found a number of wonderful sources dealing with the wives of the Kamikaze pilots, for example. What were they thinking? You know, how did they take their leave of these men as they went off to war? So their roles in the story were important. And I'm mentioning that to say that even a military historian has got to a point, certainly over my career, where women are becoming increasingly important in the story. But we'll just move it across down the line, and just a few general observations about great men, forgotten women from each of us before we widen the subject out. Hallie, what's your experience?
I wanted to just respond to something you were saying about military history, and often I find when I'm writing books, when I was writing Lady Wolsey's Whim, Scandalous Lady W, and I had to do some research into 18th century military encampments, and specifically to understand what women were there and what the women of the officers were doing. And it's sometimes very difficult to get a handle on the female perspective within military history. And that in itself, you know, needs really to be redressed and rectified. You know, the female experience has, for the most part, been written out, unless the women are queens or leaders of some description. And I mean, but this speaks much to a much larger problem in general, which I think is the fact that we tend to, or we have, defined history unquestioningly as the great deeds of great men, and often in this country and in Western history, the great deeds of white men as well. And so when you give that definition to a subject which is, dare I say, a humanity, you know, a humanities subject. And one thing about the humanities is we know that the humanities are called that because they inform us about the human experience. So why is it we're focusing so much on the experiences of elite white men when history should be the story of all of us? It should tell us what it means to be human. It should look at what the general human experience is. And to think of it in the very narrow framework that we have traditionally thought of it in is incredibly outmoded. So when we broaden it out, I think there's room for everybody, for everybody's history, not just women, but everyone else.
Okay, you're going off message a little bit, because we're going to widen it out in a while. But I want you to talk a little bit about you, because you very much bucked this trend, let's face it, and so has Natalie, and we'll come to Natalie in a moment. You've almost always written about women. You've written about women who weren't necessarily at the top of society. In fact, in many cases, it's the opposite. So why did you do that? And you seem to be implying you're a bit of an outlier, and frankly, most people haven't done that.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think within academia, I mean, there's a difference between public history and academic history and what's going on in universities. And in universities, you know, this is the bread and butter of historical study, are kind of little niche areas that people drill into and really come to understand. But I actually feel, when I've been writing, that I want to bring something entirely new to the table. And so I look for entirely new stories. And so, yes, I have written about women in the Covent Garden Ladies, which was my first book. I looked at the Harris's list of Covent Garden Ladies, which were these little, they were guidebooks to prostitutes in the 18th century. And they were short biographies of these women and their lives and how they lived. But through looking through that lens, you learn about so many things that have actually been written out of history. It's the people in the background. And women are the people in the background. For Lady Wolsey's Whim, I looked at Lady Seymour Dorothy Worsley and a very high-profile divorce separation case in the 18th century, but largely from her perspective and what was going on. With the five, I looked at the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. I think whenever you look at a period in history through somebody else's eyes, and especially through women's eyes, you get a completely different sense of what was going on. Because we get one half, and then we can get the other half if we look at women.
Dan, to what extent has your work borne out this Great Men, Forgotten Women tag we're wrestling with?
Well, I was talking to my American publisher the other day, Penguin Random House in New York, and they said, I'm out of contract at the moment, in case anyone's interested. And they said, it's a good job we've published some of your books. I said, why is that? I said, because you're a white guy writing about white guys killing white guys, and we'd never sign you. No. So, look, I've got a few remarks. The first thing is that history is a sort of, I'm going to get quite philosophical quite early. History is a sort of therapy for society, right? And it reflects, the way that we look at what happened in the past reflects what we're thinking about ourselves at present. It's also, for books like these, a commercial proposition. It's a business. And so you go with what the audience wants to read. Now, Hallie, I don't quite agree with you that academic history and trade history are at different places on this. Because at the moment, the big drive, as I see it, across publishing in trade certainly, and in television, where in television like drama production, I did a little bit of work, is for the stories of women, the forgotten stories of women. So this is the absolute zeitgeist at the moment. So it's like, this is the worst time in publishing history to be a white dude writing books about white dudes slaying white dudes. Nevertheless, there are still loads of white dudes who want to read that stuff. So I'm not totally depressed, is what I'm saying. I'm slightly hedging my bets and broadening. No, I write medieval history, and medieval history is a good case study because there were powerful women in the Middle Ages, and it is to some degree possible to write their stories. It is not as possible as many people who write those stories would have you believe, because it involves stretching evidence to a point at which it barely holds sometimes. However, it is still possible. But you've got to accept that with the Middle Ages, so this book is a sausage fest. Come on, I mean, it's men. This is the greatest hits of the Middle Ages, and it's almost entirely men. Now, that's not my fault. I'm writing about the Middle Ages. I'm going to make the Middle Ages a totally patriarchal, sort of man-driven society. And I'm being fatuous and flippant, but I'm driving at what I think is a serious point about history at the moment, which is you have to be careful when you're writing history that you don't overimpose what you wish that history had been, or fall into the sort of shrill mode of telling off history for not having matched up to current pieties. And you have to sort of also be honest about what societies were like. But I think, we all do that. We all
try to.
We all try to do that. I'm also a sort of pragmatist and a pluralist, and I think that there is we often think that history should be one thing at the moment or should be another thing at the moment. It can be all of these things at the same time.
I mean, I have to confess, I went to a rather bizarre event earlier this year run by Al Murray and James Holland, both friends of mine. And it was about 1,000 white men, mostly bald, turning up to celebrate stories of the Second World War that, generally speaking, were about British soldiers doing well. Now, I was partly responsible for whipping up the excitement, so to speak, of the crowd there, because my book, I'll just show you it again in case you've forgotten the title.
Would you tell us some more about it?
Is full of those sorts of stories. So I'd absolutely endorse what Dan's saying up to a point. I mean, not up to a point. I am endorsing what Dan's saying. There is room for writing that sort of history. There is a market for it. People want to hear about it. And the other really obvious point that I'll come to you in a second, Natalie. Sorry to sideline you while I just riff for a while.
Forgotten woman.
I mean, the other really obvious point about what we write and why we write, and this sort of informs what Dan's just said, is it's really about the sources that are available. We love, as historians, rich sources in which you've got the human detail of people's lives. Now, Hallie has laboured long and hard to get that sort of detail from people who are less obvious and more marginalised by society. But the fact is, the reality is, the real majority of, the vast majority of sources come from people who were educated, who generally speaking came from the higher echelons of society. That's why we still have their records today, because they did come from a certain strata of society. So you can make inferences and you can rebuild people's lives using other sources. But if you want that human source, that actual, diary, letter, memory, it is going to come from people. So we're not really talking specifically gender here, but we're partly talking gender, but we're also talking about class really, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute.
But if you restrict it to that I think the big mistake that what I was told when I was doing my postgraduate work was that you can never tell the story of the working classes in this country, the marginalized people, women, because they didn't leave diaries and memoirs.
Yeah.
Well, that's yes, that's true.
That's a heap of...
But it's a heap of old pants, really.
Yeah.
Because, especially now with digitization, what we have to do is really think laterally about how we're going to access these stories and how we're going to start piecing them together. Digitization has been absolutely miraculous for historians because it means that you have access to things like censuses, workhouse ledgers, social housing ledgers, parish records, and all of these things. And you can trace people through these records. And then you can...
It's still difficult to get the voice, though, isn't it? The actual authentic voice of what they were thinking.
It is. But what it isn't impossible to do is create an outline of their lives.
Yeah.
And we may not have, like Winston Churchill left, tons and tons and tons of stuff for the historians.
Do you think, sorry to interrupt, and I really shouldn't be interrupting
No, go ahead.
But do you think that there is I don't know, there's almost an opportunity for us, given the scantiness, if I can use that expression, of the type of sources you're talking about in terms of the voice. Is there room for manoeuvre, and did you use it in the 5 to actually not write like a novelist, but use a certain amount of inference to play around with history a little bit more than you would do if the sources were richer and more detailed?
I did what medievalists do. Yes, wake up, Dan.
Waiting for it to get back to the Middle Ages.
The thing is, often. So again, when I was doing my postgraduate work, I happened to be in a department in Leeds where there was a big medieval studies department, and I learned from the medievalists about what you do is you may not have very many documents, but what you may have are plans of a Cistercian abbey, and then something that somebody wrote about the Cistercian abbey, and then somebody's excavated that, and they may have found the remains of somebody who lived there. And you use pieces and other sources to help put together a bigger picture. So here, we may have another Cistercian abbey, that monastery that's, got all of these records. And then you've got this one. And so you can say, well, we know this was built at about the same time. It would have had a similar experience. And we can apply that to other times in history as well, and other people whose lives may not be as well documented. So there's no reason why we can't do it for the Middle Ages or, for ancient Rome or something like that, and not do that for more modern periods.
I do remember Tom Holland telling me years ago, his wonderful book Rubicon, which I'm sure many people in this room have read, that he was a novelist before, and actually, well, 3 of us, I don't know about you, Natalie, have you written fiction yet? Are you planning to anytime soon? It maybe is the solution.
Not so much,
but I remember Tom saying to me, actually, you've got to think like a novelist when you're trying to reconstruct ancient Rome, which is why I asked you about the 5, and also Dan. Would you say the techniques of a novelist come into writing medieval history at all?
A little bit, but structurally, and I think that's not the conversation we're having at the moment.
No.
I think, I don't want to mansplain to you, Hallie, what you were actually trying to say, but
please,
but you're not talking about acting like a medievalist. It's more like being like an archaeologist.
Yes, but medievalists
There's a lot more
archaeology.
Yes, up to a point. There is a surprising amount of documents, but I don't want to argue about the Middle Ages too much. Yeah.
Okay, so Natalie, your two books, first very successful. We know the second one's going to be successful because film companies are already circling, aren't they? I mean, it's infuriating to those of us who've been writing books for years that your first two have been optioned. Is that correct?
Yeah, but who knows what's going to happen? I mean, the thing that is amazing, listening to all of you, this is only my second book, so I've got very, very limited experience comparatively. But what did occur to me, and what I've done is almost diametrically opposed to what you've done. My two books are from the perspective of women of the aristocracy, from the upper class. But what has occurred to me from my experiences of writing Mistresses of Cliveden and the Women of Rothschild are two interesting things. In the Mistresses of Cliveden, the stories that I uncovered about these 5 incredible women, they actually had just been hidden as a result of careless archiving or just laziness, or men not thinking that the letters of their wives and their sisters and their mothers were important enough. So they just never got catalogued, and they were never as a priority. So actually delving into these archives and finding out about these forgotten lives and these forgotten stories, and the stories behind paintings like that, Anna Maria Shrewsbury and Nancy Astor and Harriet Duchess of Sutherland in the other room. That was fantastic. It was a wonderful accident of history to be able to discover it. In my second book, The Women of Rothschild, the reason that the women's sources were actually not available was because of a specific exclusion. So in 1812, when the founding father of the Rothschild dynasty died, he wrote in his will, he basically excluded all women from the bank, from the family, and therefore relegated the women of his family to footnotes in history. So it was a very different process. This was about trying to uncover secrets that had actually been imposed, and it was a kind of fatwa put on the women of the family that their stories didn't count as much as the men's.
Okay, shall we, let's widen this out a little bit, because I think we're all basically in agreement that women have been marginalised, but in my view, less so now, and as I already pointed out, even in military history, there's an attempt to build in all bits of the story. And by the way, just to emphasise the point, I wasn't just talking about women in the story that came from upper classes or even the middle classes. There are sources, certainly from the 20th century, in which you can build a much more rounded picture of how war impacts people from all kinds of societies. One of the things that I've started doing in books now is having a kind of postscript, which, including this one, in which what happens to these guys and where do they go afterwards? And a book that's coming out next year is about American servicemen who fight in the Pacific. And what happens to them after is almost as interesting as what happens to them during the war, because not a single one of them is untouched, and therefore, by their experience, maybe not surprisingly, and not a single member of their family is untouched by the experience. And just to make one last comment before I ask the specific question of the cast about going back to this book for a second. So that book was published a month ago, and since then I've been contacted by the daughter of one of the key figures in the story, who I didn't know existed, mainly because she lives in France, and she's got this wonderful memoir that her father wrote, which I wasn't able to use in this book, sadly, but it will be, and some of it will be in the paperback. Anyway, the broader point I'm trying to make is that her life was massively impacted by what he went through in the Second World War. Extraordinary stories, amazing bravery, but he did not come home unaffected. And maybe no one does come home unaffected by war, but it's the experience, it's what happens next that's interesting. So her life has been, and her relationship with him was materially affected, massively affected by what he'd gone through. And so her lived experience thereafter. Now, is there going to be a massive chapter in the book? Would there have been a massive chapter in the book? No, but there is an opportunity to emphasize. So for every guy who went to that event that I was talking about last month, who glorifies to a certain extent in war, and particularly Britain's role in war, good or bad, you need to understand the consequences as well for the generations that come after, and the children, the wives. So I think that's an important element that can sneak into military history. Anyway, enough of that. So let's move on then. We could talk about a couple of things, but let's just ask the general question, because maybe this will tease out some interesting themes in relation to the marginalisation of people and characters in history. So what do we think history is for? I mean, Dan's already touched on this, but let's start with you, Hallie. I mean, what is history for? What should it be for? I mean, how useful is it for us? Why do we all love history? Is it just stories, great stories?
Well, fundamentally, history is great stories. It should be. I mean, that's what brings us to history. I think a lot of us who write public history know that often, the way in which you access, the way in which people access history is through, great storytelling. So, I think I came to history through a number of different routes, but one of them was watching period drama. That's the way in which a lot of people come to it, or reading novels. And then suddenly you want to find out more about it, and then you read nonfiction, and then suddenly you're doing a history degree, and then you're doing another history degree. And it's kind of the gateway drug. These things that lead you into academia and academic, deep study of history. But history is, I think the problem is that sort of gateway, I think, is often reliant upon the great deeds of great men, the retelling of the same old stories again. So that very, very narrow definition, as I stated before, of what kings and generals, and some women who were queens and sometimes very powerful mistresses did. And we tell these stories over and over again to the exclusion of almost everything else. And so what happens is that when we, there's this commercial imperative that obviously, when people write books about this stuff, when television programs are made about it, it's often because people have a touch point with that. This is what they learned. They learned about the Tudors in school. They learned about the Second World War. They learned about the Victorians. So, let's give people things that they know. But people are interested in stories which aren't just rehashed over and over again. So I think we have to completely redefine how we think of history. We have to, if we look at history as stories, and stories that tell us something about what it means to be human, rather than, this very antiquated definition of what history is, which is kind of kings and, what happened in Parliament, and, that's all very important, but we need to populate it with other experiences. And that's how we make history more accessible, because quite a lot of people regard history, kids at school, and so many people aren't engaged with history, and the reason why is they don't see this, well, what does this have to do with me? What does this great statesman and the Corn Laws have anything to do with my life today? What does this king have anything to do? Why not tell history in a way in which you tell everybody's stories? You start from the bottom up, and you learn something about the past, but you learn something about the present, how we got to where we are today. And I think in that sense, we need to redefine history. We need to embrace and encompass more things.
Okay, so changes to the curriculum? That's what you're
I think
suggesting?
fundamentally, yeah.
Dan, what's your feeling?
There is a reason why we tell the same stories over and over again. And it's not just because, it's very easy to sort of parody this and say, well, we've just been bad people for so many generations that we've told all these stories over and over again and haven't woken up to the current sort of progressive pieties of our immediate age. But I think there is a purpose to telling these stories over and over and over again. And one of those is that society, if we think about oral history, for example, the retelling of the same story over and over and over again. Before we were a literate society, that's what history was. It was repeating the same old stories so that you created a generational cohesion in society so that people alive now felt that they were part of a broader thing that spanned time as well as space. Okay, so I think that's the reason we have done it like that up until this point. I also understand why we're trying to not do that at the moment, because we are the most selfish and individualistic society probably that has ever existed. Completely self-centered, completely obsessed with individual identity, completely obsessed. I mean, I think some people are obsessed with the sort of the deeds and plight of the marginalised because they have a genuine social conscience. I think some people, however, just want to see history being exactly like them and therefore justifying them doing and being whatever the hell they want. And there is no sort of broader sense of I'm connected to society. Now, that's society as it is at the moment, and I can't change that, alas. But so I don't think we should necessarily throw all of this out, because I think you have to remember, A, there is a reason for telling this stuff over and over and over again. It shouldn't, of course, be at the exclusion of telling new stories and other stories. But I will just sort of speak on behalf of the bald white man at the military history festival, just for a second, and say, that dude's pretty happy. Like, he likes this stuff. Yeah. And I tell you what he doesn't like, and I sound like Nigel fucking Farage, I realise. I'm not. I'm a pretty
Never
liberal.
thought you would, did you?
I'm a pretty liberal guy, but I also get frustrated. I feel like Larry David now, suddenly. Personas. That dude gets pretty annoyed with being ticked off for liking what he likes.
But who's ticking him off for liking
well,
what he likes?
but I think that...
he does get ticked off.
I think he feels...
No doubt,
okay,
right?
let me tell you how he feels when he hears
get...
you saying that we should completely rethink history. He feels told off.
Why? But why?
Because he likes his shit, and it's like, that's what
But
he's into.
why should that have anything to do with him liking his shit? Why?
No, because implicit in what you were saying is there should be less of that.
No, I never said there should be less of that.
If your point is there's room for all of it,
there's room
of
for
course
all
we
of
agree
it.
with that.
Yeah.
No one would disagree with that.
Okay, all right. Well, yes, we're back to my point then.
Okay.
I'll have this point.
There's
room for all of us.
Natalie, can I ask you? So
Yes,
you
please, jump in.
Please, Natalie, say something. Stop the children from fighting.
Like Dan, you're a distinguished Cambridge graduate, and you did a history degree, and you performed brilliantly academically at it. Did you feel, as an undergraduate, that the history you were learning and the lecturers who were teaching you were skewing history in a man-centric way, a male-centric way? Did you ever have that feeling?
Well, I think, first of all, going back to your original point about what history should be, I think that's quite a dangerous way to start researching history or start writing a book. I don't think you can begin a project by thinking what it should be. I think what you've got to do is actually look at the facts and look at the stories. And actually, for me, what I've tried to do is write the stories of humans and the human experience and the individuals. So there's no agenda for me. It's not about, where I think they should sit in the social spectrum, or I'm not trying to make a point. All I'm trying to do is tell the stories of these people in the most accurate way I possibly can, according to their letters, according to their diaries. So it's really very little of my voice and all of their voice. So I would never approach a history as a should. It's what I find. So that's number one. Number two, at Cambridge, it was just thoroughly wonderful. I had a wonderful time. I had brilliant teachers, and I don't think, it was about the quality of what they were teaching me and the quality of what they were saying and the validity of the arguments. It wasn't really about a male-female skewing or any... It was just about how fantastic these stories were. And I think that's what history is for me. It just comes down to storytelling. Yeah. And if it's good storytelling based on great facts and reliable sources, and it's beautifully researched, then it has as much right to be on the bookshelf as anything else.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And can I say something in defence of Dan's book as well, which is
the Bible for the white guy.
There is a reason why people watch Game of Thrones, which I honestly think if I were teaching, if I were teaching, GCSE students, and I said you want to watch the most historically accurate television series about the Middle Ages and about the way people lived their lives, the mindset of the Middle Ages, watch Game of Thrones.
Is that fair to say? Because before you answer that, Dan, one quick comment.
Because although it's totally fictionalized, I want to say that as a disclaimer, and it has nothing to do with the Middle Ages, it manages to get into that world. And I think that it's no coincidence that the cover of your book, if you want to hold it up again.
No, I'd be happy to. I'll just keep it up for the rest of the...
There's a direct, what I'm saying is that there's this idea that, fantastic stories come from real life. And that, history is full of these fantastic stories.
Hallie, what Game of Thrones does so brilliantly, as you know, and anyone in this room who's seen it will know, is actually the most important and interesting figures in that series are women. They are the heroes, really, or the heroines of the story. They're not marginalised in the slightest. And admittedly, most of them, are vaguely connected to the royal families of these various different dynasties. But I'm sure that one of the reasons it's been so successful is you get a proper, gender kind of neutral sense of power and the use of power and the abuse of power. And actually, of course, the best figure in it is Cersei, who's, absolute monster, but she's a woman, and that's okay to say, because some women are monsters. And while I'm on that subject, I just want to remind everyone that Margaret Macmillan was asked a question very recently. So Margaret Macmillan, the distinguished Oxford historian, I think, is that right? I think she is, and aunt of Dan Snow, was asked the other day if she felt that the world would be a better place if women ran it, in other words, if they were politicians and generals. And she said, absolutely not. Women are just as capable of the abuse of power and being sucked into the whole, use and misuse of power as men are. So with that as an aside, we'll move on really to the last sort of stage. So does history need a rebrand? We've sort of agreed that it does and it doesn't. I mean, you think it needs a rebrand, but we don't want to get rid of all the good stuff.
Oh, look, I think history's in rude health. I mean, I think we do a lot of arguing with each other about it and about what it should be, and it usually comes down to it should be the way I do it. That's what it usually comes down to, doesn't it, when we have our arguments. But history's in rude health. Look at this wonderful audience in front of us, packed at 11:30 on a Saturday morning, right? You could be doing anything, but you're here listening to us drivel on about history. That's pretty amazing. Every major broadcaster is still commissioning historical documentaries, albeit on slimmer budgets and historical drama's booming, booming. There's just this hunger for stories set in recognisable past places, and there's a hunger certainly on the part of producers. Let's put producers and audiences into slightly different boxes for stories that reflect our modern discussions about the world we're living in through the lens of a historical period setting. Throughout the entertainment industry, which we're sort of part of, throughout the more serious kind of non-fiction, literary industry, history is in absolutely rude health. And I think that if it weren't, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be frantically just trying to sell, the last book that we'd done.
So are as well.
Well, we're doing that as well. Yeah, I'm trying to slip it in like a policeman. We're going to sell them the books in a minute. No, I think it's in great shape. It's in fantastic shape. We're having a lovely time, aren't we?
Natalie, do you think the television interest or film interest in your two stories is because it's about great houses and aristocracy? Or do you think it's about women? I mean, you might suspect it's the former, it's the kind of Downton Abbey effect, but I might be wrong. What do you think?
Again, I wouldn't say it's because of great houses or because they're women. I would like to think it's because they're great stories about fascinating human beings and individuals. So I think the danger is to kind of pigeonhole, and say what, to limit yourself to why something is interesting. And going back to your point, does history need a rebrand? I don't think history needs a rebrand per se, but I think what we have to do as historians and interested people is constantly question the kind of history we're writing, the kind of history we're reading, the kind of history we expect. As long as we keep asking those questions, then I think history will be in rude health. It's when we have that unequivocal acceptance of what we're reading and what we're digesting that we're in trouble.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, Dan made the point that nothing wrong with these guys, the independent company as they're known, reading what they like. In an ideal world, we would have a proper breadth of reading, wouldn't we? We'd read a bit of that. We'd read about the five.
Why?
I mean,
why? Why tell people what they should like? That's what annoys people, is being told, well, you like this, but you should be liking more. You like apples, but you should also like bananas and pears as well.
Nobody's telling what people should like.
Yeah, they are. This is the tone of discourse from the sort of the what is often characterised as the cosy liberal elite. It's you guys don't like the right thing. And then that's where the populists get in. Because they come along and say, you poor people, you've been told by those dreadful...
Dan, you seem to be a little bit prickly about this. Have you had a few comments about your book that set you off?
haven't, because nobody of a sort of, a cosy liberal elite persuasion would read my books, right?
Okay.
They just wouldn't.
Fair point.
And I'm kind of comfortable with that. I do have actually cosy liberal metropolitan values.
Yeah.
However, I am a pragmatist and a realist. Let me tell you what Jay-Z says, all right? This is the only time Jay-Z will be quoted in this weekend, I bet. Jay-Z says, you got to feed them sugar, right? You got to feed them sugar. You got to draw them in with, like, so in Jay-Z's world, this was, you got to draw people in with stories of having sold crack on the streets and the gang stories and the money and the cars and stuff. And then you can feed the progressive politics and the conscious mindset underneath. But you smuggle it in, you do it that way around. That's my trick.
Yeah.
I'm doing the canonical, slightly traditional, old-fashioned stuff. I did it with Crusaders, less than I did with this book. When I did a book about the Crusades a couple of years ago, I thought, man, I just can't do Richard the Lionheart and Saladin beefing and like that being the whole. But if I don't put that in my book about the Crusaders, nobody who reads sort of mainstream medieval history is going to buy it. They're going to think it's some like, oh no, this is some preachy kind of woke version of the Crusades. I don't want that. Right, so I am triangulating here, like Tony Blair, only not bombing people. Yet. I will be soon.
A couple more minutes.
Yeah. Shouldn't have had 2 coffees. So what I did with Crusaders was put together a traditional-looking, feeling, shaped book about the Crusades, but made sure that all the way through women's stories were to the fore. And each main part was led by the story of a female crusader. Yeah. But it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to bang you over the head with tipping this history upside down. I was just saying, look, this was a slightly broader world than you might realise, but don't worry, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin will be along in a minute to make you feel safe. So, look, this is, I sound very cynical, but I believe, maybe because I have a sort of commercial mind to this, and I do a bit of publishing, and I have to send my kids to school and feed them based on the sales of these books. So I have quite a pragmatic approach to it, which is you say, look, here's what your audience is actually like. Let me tell you one more example. This year I produced a drama about Anne Boleyn for Channel 5. Jodie Turner-Smith played Anne Boleyn.
Oh, of course.
Man alive, that was great stuff from a commissioning point of view. We had a powerful black woman playing Anne Boleyn. We had a brilliant script written by, almost entirely produced by a fantastic female writing team, production team. It looked beautiful. We shot it in budget. Jodie was amazing. The whole thing was great. All we got was abuse. All we got was abuse for having slightly tweaked this thing. And the viewing figures were, on the overnights, were slightly worse than my building Britain's canals. Now, we were super happy in the end, I think, because the press, the channel had never had press like this for any show ever. Everyone in the business looked at this show and was like, damn, that's amazing. Everyone was writing kind of articles about it. You had the culture wars all over it. The Channel 5 viewer was like, well, this ain't the Yorkshire Vet. I mean, what? So all I'm saying is I think we have to, much as we would like to re-engineer history and rebuild it and think about it, you've got to accept that societies, audiences are a few paces behind.
Extreme examples.
No, they're not. They're extreme examples. This is Tuesday night at 9 o'clock on Channel 5.
Not
many people realise that, unfortunately.
But I mean, everything can't be divided into a kind of culture war. That this is like, if somebody wants something different, then that means that what we used to have is now under threat. That isn't the case. It's about thinking about...
Hallie, but a minute ago you were saying we've got to rethink history entirely and rebuild it from the ground up.
No, I said we have to rethink what history is. If we include... I mean, if you think about the fact that, history was literally defined, as a subject that white aristocratic men should study in order to be good leaders, well, how is that applicable? What I'm talking about is getting people interested in history. And one of the things we have to think about is, it's great to have a room full of people, but there are a lot of people who, there's a reason why we're not in the bigger tent. Okay.
Hold on a second.
No,
Rude.
No, there is.
Natalie. Right. I'm done with her. It's your turn now.
The reason we're not in the
Natalie
bigger tent
insisted
is because
we were in the
this
great
is my favourite
Okay,
place to
okay,
speak.
okay. Thank you. Okay, so I will roll back on
But
that
next
one.
time we'll go in the
Okay,
bigger
good.
tent. Yeah.
Because you know we know everybody should know that Dan and I are actually good friends and we go back a long way. And Saul and I are very good friends. We go back a long way.
Were.
And were always.
Dead.
But I mean we know that history can be a hard sell because the first thing people have said to me, what relevance does that have in my life today? And that's the hurdle we have to get over.
But isn't that the job of the historian?
That
to
is.
make it relevant,
Exactly.
regardless of what the story is. Regardless of where in society that person is, the subject is, it has to be relevant because it's about the human condition ultimately. So
it's about
a
the human
failing with
condition.
us if we are unable to make people relate to what we're writing.
Yeah.
That is something that we as storytellers need to investigate.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You need to move people. Now, I would love to continue this. And I tweeted earlier, I thought this conversation might get heated, and that was a joke, actually, because we're all good friends.
It's on you, man.
But actually,
this idea.
it has been a lot more combative and all the more interesting than I expected. Anyway, time is moving on, so we're going to throw the questions out to the floor. Who would like to answer a question? If you could just hang on until you get the microphone, just so we can hear you clearly. Would anyone here would like to ask a question of any or all of the panel?
So obviously you guys have kind of directed this at Saul and Dan, but you've got like a big presence with these communities you talk about, that love what you write, and I think that's amazing. But do you therefore feel that because actually these guys, and it is mainly guys, and obviously we would love to think that all of them completely believe in equality and there's no misogyny, and like realistically that's probably not going to be true. Do you not think because they have their trust in you, they love what you write, do you feel like maybe if they're going to listen to anyone...
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about. You've got to feed them sugar. Like
Yeah,
you come
yeah.
in and then I'm like the cuckoo in the nest. Except instead of throwing all the
Totally
chicks
agree.
out, I'm like really kind to them.
Yeah, amazing.
Teach them love.
Yeah, so like
we-
your army festival, I can't remember
Yes.
what you said, went to.
Warfest.
Warfest, yeah. If you had stood up there and actually spoken to them about, all the women who died in Iraq fighting, or, although a lot of them might have gone rough and puff and, that's not why we came, it might just lodge that actually there were also women in it.
I think Dan's already made the point, which is you have to it's softly. You can't just hit them with something they're not expecting. I was booked to talk about my book, and of course you can. I think Dan's absolutely right. So it's insidious, really. They're buying something they think is about big boys and firing guns, and what they're actually getting, whether they're conscious of it or not, are other stories about the effect of war. So they may glorify in their own minds, I'll never go to war, but my grandfather was amazing. As soon as they realize, actually, as I was explaining at the beginning of this talk, the consequences for families, that's their family. It's everybody in this country who has a serviceman that fought in any war, but particularly the Second World War, will not have been unaffected by it. So I think Dan's right. You give them mostly what they want, but what was it? Sugar. You give them sugar, and then you slowly but surely change attitudes. Hallie wants to do it more quickly, but Hallie's got a different audience to us.
And can I just say, it's very easy for me to say, right? It's really easy for me to say. So Hallie, in a way, you've taken the most kind of dude subject, Jack the Ripper, and done the most kind of cool, progressive, awesome, fantastic book. But I think it would be. Can I say it's not been particularly easy on you?
No, it's been horrific.
It's been bullshit for you.
Yeah.
Right?
So
which I am massively privileged, obviously, because I'm a white dude called Dan, and I can just go around the world doing what I want, saying what I want, and people won't come up to me usually because I'm, like
You're a big white
aggressive.
guy. Yeah.
I'm a big white guy, and I got a tattoo. Or if they come at me on the internet, it doesn't really happen. So it's easy for me to say. I totally get that, and I'm not as crass as perhaps I sound.
Oh, I know you're not.
Should we? Another question.
Hi. With the rebrand you were just talking about, sorry, am I?
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. With the rebrand you were talking about, rebranding history, I'm sorry, I'm back here.
Oh, there you are.
Hello.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Hi. You were talking about rebranding history, and I think with the impact of everybody being stuck behind their TVs and the runaway success of Bridgerton, how did that affect each of you to think, well, that obviously is fictionalized, and what would you do? What was your immediate thoughts of, what can I write? Oh my goodness, do I want to rewrite something from scratch, thinking about the fact that, so much diversity was put into that play as well, which was phenomenal for everybody to be able to see, and I think very, very timely as well.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment about that, because I think Bridgerton did it beautifully, and the reason it works so well is because it's fictional.
Yeah.
It's not, the problem with, the problem Dan got into, or at least the problem the programme got into in terms of any criticism, is this is a real person, we've completely, and we are messing with history. So Bridgerton is brilliant because let's create a fictional universe in which we people it with all kinds of diverse characters. We concentrate, one of the, I'm sort of going off the tangent here a little bit, but one of the reasons Upstairs, Downstairs was so successful, talking about big houses, it's about people, but not just the aristocrats, but the people below stairs. That's what moves everyone, isn't it? So Bridgerton, brilliant, but stick to fictional setting. But too often, as we all know, people want to have their cake and eat it. They want a true story that has name recognition, famous events, but let's manipulate it. Let's change it all around. Let's put characters in there who couldn't possibly have been there, and we still think we can, we can pull it off, and I think it's harder to do. Does anyone else want to have a shot at answering that question about Bridgerton and whether or not it made us...
I'll echo what you said in that, Bridgerton was wonderfully successful. People love Jane Austen, they love Regency stuff. That's a given. But again, this isn't history. It's fiction.
And it's fantasy.
And it's fantasy.
Well, yes, and this sort of ties in Thrones as well. When you're setting out and I say this from limited experience, but some experience, when you're setting out your stall to make a historical drama, the cleverest producers will think about this, and the people like me will not think about it until it's too late. You've got to be very, very clear about what you're doing very early on. Now, why Bridgerton works and Thrones works is because they didn't pretend to be actual history.
Yeah, exactly.
They were really super clear about, here's the setting, our story's made up. Thrones is just perfect because this looks like the Wars of the Roses, but guess what? I've turned the map upside down, and I've turned everything upside down, and I've brought in some of this and that. So I can do what I want. There's your license.
Dragon or two.
Bridgerton, we've just discussed. People get more annoyed when it's, so has anyone seen The Last Duel, the new Ridley Scott movie? Just came out. It's about a famous duel in 1386 in France. It's a very well done movie. It's just a Rashomon telling of a rape trial in France that went to judicial duel between the husband of the woman who was raped and the man she accused of raping her, the rapist. And I rated it quite high on historical accuracy because it's almost right. However, because it purports to be the telling of this story, what glares out from it are the things that it doesn't get right. It gets 90% of the stuff right. It even gets Matt Damon's stupid mullet right. That's like an original mullet. But it messes with like a couple of little details, and then if you know the story, you're like, it wasn't quite like that. So the problem that Damon and his writing partners have come up against there is, we're going to tell you the real story, and then you just don't quite do it. So that's when it becomes problematic.
But don't you think that's part of a different conversation that we could,
I think it is, of course.
spend?
Yeah, well, that's next year.
Because the challenges of making people interested in history, giving them the sugar, but how much of the sugar, when it's presented on TV, how much is fabricated, how much is fantasy, and how strictly do we need to stick to the actual empirical facts in order to draw in the audience?
So let's because you've got a couple of projects on the go, and fingers crossed they come off. Was there anything about the success of Bridgerton that would influence you, if you have any influence over the making of these, and let's hope you do, Natalie, that would make you think, actually, we can do it in a slightly different way? Are there lessons to learn from Bridgerton, do you think?
Well, there was a lot of sex in Bridgerton. I wouldn't particularly want the Mistresses of Clibden to be, a bonkathon. But, I think... Really?
Yeah, well, next year's panel will talk about this.
No, but I think, again, Bridgerton, fabulous characters, fabulous stories, really, really well told, bit of gratuitous sex, bit of gratuitous violence, never did any, viewing figures any harm. I don't know, let's see what the professionals do with it.
Okay, we've got time, I think, for probably a couple more. Yes, there was one, I think you were going to ask a question before.
Yeah, this is less of a question and more of a rebuttal and a sort of follow-on from what other people are saying. So I guess the question is, what do you think at the end of what I've said? But in the sort of way that you framed the military history and the consumers of your books and the war fest or whatever it was, there's almost this assumption that women weren't there and that we're pigeonholing them in and saying, oh, but the wives, think about their stories. What about the women who were agents? If you look at the English Civil War, women were soldiers. And I think, again, with the sort of suggestion of race and Bridgerton and, we're shoehorning in, an Anne Boleyn who isn't white or whatever, people got outraged about the 1917 movie when there was a Sikh soldier, and people had to say, no, that was true. That really did happen. There really were people who weren't just white and British fighting these wars. So this whole idea of giving women, the history of women as this sugar, it's almost as if men are outraged that women were there in the first place. So I think we've had to sort of make this feminist history just about women in order to sort of balance up the narratives and say, I'm really sorry that you're upset women were there, but they were.
Well, thank you. There's been a lot of work done, including by many of my students, actually. I've just hung up my teaching boots recently, but an awful lot of my students, female students in particular, wanted to work on subjects of the contribution women had made to war. Now, I was teaching an MA in military history, so inevitably it was about conflict. And it was astonishing how much material was available to find and how many women had played a combat role in history. Now, it took them, it took their agency to actually dig up this material, but that it was out there and that they had made this contribution, there is no doubt. So yes, I agree with you up to a point. I think what Dan's and my point about the sugar is, it's not, we're not just throwing a bone and just saying, okay, well, there's a sort of tiny bit of female influence on the side. What we are saying is, if the sort of books we write and commercially sell, they expect the meat of the story to be about the guns going off, then of course in an ideal world, you would slip in more of those stories of women at war. And there are plenty of them, actually. I've got a student who's working on the contribution of Wrens in the Second World War. There was a wonderful book recently about the Wrens basically helping the sinking of the Bismarck ship, these Y operators, and intercepting all this information. So there are amazing stories, but people need to be looking for them. Will it be Dan and I writing a book about Wrens? Probably not. But we're not saying for a second that there isn't room. You will be writing books about
Well, I'll tell you one of the books for next year. So I work with a digital artist called Marina Amaral. Brazilian artist, fantastically talented young woman from Brazil, and she digitally colorizes black and white photographs. And we've done 2 books together so far. One was called The Colour of Time. It was a history of the world from 1850 to 1950, the sort of black and white era coloured in. We did a second one called The World of Flame, sort of long walk kind of thing, First World War, Second World War. And the conversation we constantly had as we went along doing these books was, man, oh man, there's a lot of guys with beards. When we're selecting the photos, you've got 200 photos per book. And we kept going, and how can we tell this big story? And so the balance, we both loved both books, but there was this thing this sucks. This is still such a dudes with beard kind of project. So for our next project, we're doing 1850, 1950, just women. And every single story there is dope, and every single story is new, and every single story is completely cool. So yeah, it's completely possible to do, and I'm doing it at the moment. So
it is. It is possible to do.
The world is full of surprises.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. I think you've got to get people interested with a sort of, if you like this, you'll like that sort of.
If you like The Colour of Time and all those
You'll
dudes
like
with beards,
this, yeah.
here's this without the dudes with beards.
you will.
Yeah, that's the sell.
But also, there's your name, so you have lent yourself
Right.
now to doing that.
Yeah.
So fans of your brilliant work are going to be
Here
drawn in, and then they'll be able to
Absolutely.
look at your view of women's history.
Right,
So-
I'm mansplaining.
So you should know, but you should be writing
No,
about the
of
Wrens,
course.
both of you.
So,
There's no
yeah.
reason you shouldn't.
So that was the plot twist at the end.
Okay, final question, I think. Time for one more. Up at the front here, as long as there wasn't a... Sorry, they're just behind you. I think the hand got up just before yours.
Hi, thanks very much. Oh, yeah, working. I was just wondering, sort of based off the title of the talk of sort of like history, herstory, and women sort of being sidelined through history, and it is something I think that we are, as we've sort of discussed, is becoming more of a zeitgeisty thing at the moment. Funnily enough, I actually also went on a Jack the Ripper walking tour recently, and speaking to the tour guide beforehand, she was saying how important it was for her to present the victims of the Ripper as actually being women with full lives and families that loved them, and sort of a whole backstory, and not sort of just five faceless victims that you see the gory photographs of, etc., etc. But I was just wondering, do you think that's something that will stick, or will that be a trend that will revert to type at some point?
I think everything ends up being integrated. I mean, that's part of a process of evolution and change in subjects. And, I mean, history, that's the other thing is, like, we really just cannot, history is not a static thing. If you look at history writing at any other period of time, it's entirely different, and history does reflect the society. We search for stories that, I hate to say validate us, but, kind of reflect us in some ways. Obviously, the historian's job is to try, not to impose one's modern view on their research and what they're doing and how they're telling the story. I mean, everybody has biases, it's going to happen. But, history evolves, and often we take with us a lot of things that develop, and it becomes part of how history is written. I don't think it's a trend that's going to fall away.
Okay, I think we better... Oh, one last very quick question.
Can I just talk about the book, which I think Natalie
Sure.
would love to talk more a little bit, the Women of Rothschild, because the topic which is very close to my heart is classical music, and I know about Charlotte, or she was called Mrs. James de Rothschild, one of the great Parisian hostesses, thanks to whom Chopin stayed in Europe, not gone to America. So maybe if Natalie would love to say something about her favorite Rothschild woman.
I would love to, and actually,
but it
if
would be a
everyone
topic.
wants to come back at 2
Okay.
o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to
Yes.
be talking about them all.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all.
Okay, so I think we're going to end it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll end it there. So thank you so much. Just if you could all give a round of applause to the wonderful panel.